Okay, be seated. Welcome everybody. Tonight we are going to talk about implicit bias, which is a term, rather recent term from social psychology, theories of social cognition, referring to automated processes, aspects of our prejudiced judgments and behavior. So if you think Hamas is a very nice club, you see acts of resistance and you see Israeli roadblocks blocking the way to freedom. If you don't like Hamas, you see terrorists and you see acts of violence, you see something different. Prejudiced behavior, prejudiced judgment, implicit bias is guiding us through our days, and especially guiding us through our politics. Politics is a lot about inclusion and exclusion, groups that are in, groups that are out. And if you happen to be out, you are actually not perceived at all, or maybe perceived in a bad light. So implicit bias has a lot to do with perception. Now, art, arguably, can make us change perspective, which is, by the way, the slogan of this university. And so can art actually address these prejudices? Can art address this kind of implicit bias? Can it help us, make us aware of that which we are normally unaware of? Or maybe is art itself a political act? Is art itself governed by in and out structures? What gets into the museum and what doesn't get into the museum at all. These are the issues that tonight will be addressed by a very eminent speaker, Tina Chanter, who is a professor of philosophy at Kingston University in London. Tina Chanter has a long career. She's written numerous articles and books on topics like gender, art, tragedy. And this, what she's going to do tonight, is actually taken from a forthcoming book, a hopefully forthcoming book, because it sits with Bloomsbury, which has become one of the most unreliable presses in the British Isles. But someday it will be forthcoming, a book on art politics in the footsteps of the French thinker Jacques Rancière, thinking through the consequences of what he has said about his issue, and he will also be a topic that will be discussed tonight. My name is Kees Leijners. On behalf of the Radboud Reflects program, I wish you a very nice evening. First, Professor Chanter is going to give her lecture, then we will have a talk about it, and then there will be ample opportunity for you to ask her the questions you want to ask. So have a very nice evening. Tina Chanter. Okay, good luck.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everybody who has made this visit so far really wonderful. We've had a chance to talk to a seminar this afternoon, and I think some of the members of that seminar are here. So thanks, Chantal, thanks, Paul, thanks, Kees. So let me begin. So as Kees said, the topic of my talk tonight is implicit bias, and specifically on art and Rancière. So the first part of the talk is just a fairly general discussion of Rancière, and then I will go into some examples of art. And part of the point is to draw inspiration from Rancière, but also to challenge a little bit his framework. So let me begin. Can everyone hear me okay? So perceptions acquire a rigidity that comes to light only when they break into pieces, only when they shatter. We just do not realize most of the time how hemmed in we are by them, these ways the world presents itself to us. And then one day, as Chinua Achebe, following William Butler Yeats, puts it, things fall apart. With such dislocations, the knowledge that, as it turns out, this fluff, this cotton wool, this unspecifiable environment, this atmosphere held together comes tumbling down. Who would have known it was so important? This all too vague, ineffable gauze, this finely woven, all but transparent fabric of the world, it glues together the things we think we know. But it is not knowledge itself. It is implicit, assumed, tacitly agreed. It facilitates knowledge. It feeds into the background that allows knowledge to have settled where it is. Malleable but all too susceptible to fixity, having settled into undisturbed grooves along which our thoughts travel, into habits that structure perceptual patterns, into psychic and discursive tics that replay themselves over and over, repeating and refining themselves perhaps, but adhering more or less to the same scenario. There is something important about this fabric of the world, being not quite knowledge, yet having something to do with knowledge. In being misaligned with what it is we think we know, it can turn into a site of resistance to knowledge. What is the difference between What is the difference between failing to notice a pile of stones in an idyllic landscape and seeing the pile of stones as a roadblock, preventing the access of Palestinians to goods vital to their survival? It is the difference between allowing one's gaze to pass over a pile of stones as an unobtrusive part of the landscape and seeing that pile of stones as preventing people who live on their native land from going to their place of work, from seeing their families, as a roadblock that interferes with their freedom of movement, with their seeing, with their way of life. What is the difference between seeing something and not seeing it? Nothing more, perhaps, than connecting up a minuscule event, a small observation, with a series of other minute perceptions and allowing the pattern they form to emerge as significant. What is the difference between trusting someone absolutely and seeing them as a threat to one's very existence? Or the difference between reading a situation in terms of racism and not reading it as such? What is the difference between the pathological and the so-called normal? Almost nothing, and yet there is all the difference in the world. Every now and then a break occurs, a fissure, a rupture, a fault appears, things shift, new objects become visible, things arrange themselves in different patterns in new ways. We see things in a completely different light. How this happens is uncertain and cannot be foretold, prescribed, or predicted. An historically sedimented environment, riven with affects, is just there until, all of a sudden, it isn't. It undergoes a shift. And precisely as it does so, we can sometimes catch sight of it, just a glimpse at first, but slowly we can begin to record, classify, unpick, analyze, adumbrate its features. We can begin to put them together in a different way, discard some of them, refigure others, let them fall into new patterns, reimagine them. This might be done more or less consciously, more or less deliberately. With each slight shift, new possibilities can occur, new perspectives can open up as old ones close down. This play back and forth between objects in the world and our conceptual, imaginative, and affective grasping of them is what Immanuel Kant considers in terms of faculties of understanding, judgment, and reason, and the knowledge of nature, the feeling of pleasure or displeasure, and the principles of morality that the faculties provide. We might say this play is what Kant refers to in the Critique of Judgment as cognition in general. To break the habits of perception is to break the patterns of knowledge, to rework the discursive frameworks that make sense of sensory knowledge, and to reframe the enunciative possibilities that define and legitimate knowledge as objective. Artists make such interventions, so do political actors. Art and politics are two different ways of redistributing the sensible, as Jacques Rancière puts it. What distinguishes them is that while politics focuses upon the emergence of a new collective subject, the emergence of a new we, art affects new forms of visibility, making available new possibilities for perceiving the world, and in the process rearranging the conditions of enunciative possibility. For quite a long time now, I've been thinking about how things become visible, while other things remain invisible, about what it takes for something to be seen, and why it eludes visibility, about the way in which politics is shaped by forces that are irreducible to concepts or intellect, about how there is something aesthetic in the broadest sense in this shaping, about how things arrange themselves, present themselves, are noticed or ignored, are read or remain insignificant, how they obtrude or fade into the background to the point of becoming not just negligible, but invisible, unavailable, unseen, non-existence, how they do not count. A flick of a switch is all it takes, after which nothing will ever be the same again, And yet, even if it is not the same as before, it too will become habitual. It will come to constitute part of the commonsensical way of seeing things. None of us is immune. I've seen it happen. I've been part of it. I've been assimilated into what Chanter calls the police order. So have you. The police order is how we think, how we make sense of the world, what constitutes itself as common sense. Take feminism, for example. First there was sexism, then there was feminism. Feminism became part of the police order insofar as it started policing who could and who could not count as a woman. Then there was the transgender movement. And as feminists, we found ourselves having to rethink why certain body parts had somehow become essential to what it had come to mean to be a woman, and who had the right to determine which body parts qualified, and how some feminism's policing of bodies reflected in highly problematic ways the very order it thought it was trying to escape. How we see things limits or opens up the possibilities for thought and the meanings we attach to what we see. Shifts in perception are bound up with shifts in thinking, shifts in what seems possible or impossible, while changes in the perceptible are not related to changes in the possibility of that which can be thought by causal necessity. There is nonetheless an intricate relationship between, on the one hand, what we see and what we do not see, between visibility and invisibility, between what we hear and do not hear or cannot hear, between the perceptible and the imperceptible, and on the other hand, the significance that assumes salience and legitimacy, circulates as knowledge, becomes sanctioned. There is, in other words, a relationship between what we see, hear, or perceive, more specifically, what it is possible to see, and meanings that become prevalent, accepted, or dominant, and which, as such, constitute, determine, and govern the limits of both perception and understanding. The possibilities of comprehension are circumscribed by implicit political assumptions and, I would add, psychological habits that define the borders of communities and, as such, determine the contours and limits of comprehension. Things arrange themselves according to narratives that take on a certain self-evidence, and then they come to appear to us as the way things are. Yet this very appearance, the very possibility of appearance, is already circumscribed by particular narratives presenting themselves as if they were the truth, as if they had universal purchase, as if there were no point of access from which to question them. Meanings become institutionalized and appear unavoidable. The way the world appears to us conforms to institutionalized ways of appearance. The very possibilities of seeing and knowing, of doing and being, are circumscribed in advance, but this circumscription remains unavailable for thematization, insofar as it coincides with what presents itself as the only possible way of seeing. This is what Chanter calls the police order, which presents itself as the natural order. It passes itself off as the truth, presenting itself simply as given. The efficacy of political or aesthetic dissensus is unpredictable and contingent. It erupts without warning, and when it does so, things begin to line up differently in a new order of the perceptible. They settle into new places, occupy new functions, and the way things line up distributes people in new roles. There is what Chanter calls a redistribution of the sensible. Sometimes art effects a shift in perception. There is no telling when or whether it will do this. There is no causal necessity. There is nothing inherent about the impact a work will have on a viewer or the effect a film will have on a spectator. There is no direct line of transmission from artist to audience, no guarantee that what the author intends is that which the reader will understand. And this is how it should be. Otherwise, the work would be didactic. It would fall into the trap of telling us what to think, and we would become passive recipients of ideas that are communicated to us. The artist would reveal a hidden truth. The artwork would be revelatory, and the spectator would remain an empty vessel ready to be filled with whatever the one who knows the truth intends to communicate. The artist would be the one who knows, and the spectator would be the one who is ignorant, in whom knowledge is deposited, a passive repository. Enlightenment would be granted. Were art guaranteed to be completely successful in eliciting certain affects and in motivating certain reactions, it would succeed in its political aspirations precisely to the extent that it also succeeded in evacuating its status as art, in no longer being art, but in becoming politics. We can think this through by referring to an example of a work that Chanter thinks risks completely collapsing art into politics, and such that nothing is left of the art except a political message, where art disappears and all that is left is a slogan. Rancière takes a critical distance from artists such as Martha Rosler, whose, and this is a quote from Rancière, photomontages accentuate the heterogeneity of elements, end quote. For example, balloons. A work that is part of the series Bringing the War Home, House Beautiful, in which Rosler registered her protest against the Vietnam War. Against the background of a serene domestic space, a man holds a dead child in his arms. Rancière says, quote, the image of the dead child could not be integrated into the beautiful exterior without exploding it, end quote. The heterogeneous clash is intended to, quote, reveal the imperialist violence behind the happy display of goods and images, end quote. Rosler's art is intended to, quote, show the spectator what she does not know how to see and make her feel ashamed of what she does not want to see, end quote. Such an artist, as Rancière sees it, adopts what he calls the pedagogical position of the one who knows, one whose art will play a revelatory role in which the artist adopts the position of the expert, whose task it is to enlighten an ignorant viewer in order to mobilize action in the form of a graphic presentation or of a contradiction to underline the hypocrisy of the military-industrial complex endemic to capitalism. In doing so, Rancière suggests that Rosler's art loses its identity in serving the unambiguously political, agenda-driven message that the capitalist war machine is hypocritical. The question Rancière raises is whether in making these points, a work of art becomes too didactic to remain a work of art in any meaningful sense, or whether it crosses a definitive line and becomes politics. What the work of art does not do, according to Rancière's conception of what makes art political, is to tell us what to think, or ensure a particular reaction, or establish a causal relation between whatever affect the artist might have intended to inspire and an action that intervenes in the world. Political art, in the sense that Rancière understands it, does not depict a state of affairs that it decries in order to counteract that state of affairs. It does not content itself with depicting victims of genocide in order to solicit action, for example. If it did so, the artist would be appealing to a straightforward causal relation between whatever the intention behind an artistic representation of a particular state of affairs might be, the promotion of certain negative affects in the spectator or viewer, for example, and the translation of those affects into a motivation to act in the world in order to transform the situation represented. Rather, visibility itself is underwritten by certain legitimating narratives that prevent us from seeing, blinding us, and eclipsing from view that which might later come to be seen as quite obviously unjust, exclusionary, unequal, racist. Such narratives have often been unselfconsciously woven into the fabric of national collectivities. The distribution and figuration of affects play into the ways in which such collectivities understand themselves. To question the ways of seeing that such narratives legitimate is to interrogate that which passes as sanctioned, publicly accepted mythologies that have established themselves as truths or as just the way things are. In Fear and Loathing, a 2014 work with the use of masks through which we see the eyes and mouths of speakers, we'll get to these images in a minute. Julian Waring frames faces in ways that dislocate gender and age cues as we listen to traumatic confessions of individuals whose identities are partially disguised. The masks cover over most of the speaker's face, so that we only see their eyes and mouth, enough to discern the color of their skin, but not enough to read their expressions. In a 1977 work, 2 into 1, by having the words of a speaker lip-synced by another speaker, which I think we'll see in a second, Waring both makes visible and puts into question the gendered and age expectations we typically bring to what we see and hear by disrupting these expectations.
I'm intelligent and sophisticated. Well, sophisticated means, you know about the world. So when you get, obviously everyone does, but I'm only 11 and I just already know about it. But when you come out, out of university or school, and you know what everything is.
My sons are unusual, and they are absolutely adorable. And they're very bright and very alive and full of life. And they've got very, very strong personalities. And sometimes obviously they drive me mad, but they love me, I suppose. And they can be quite cruel too. They do actually say to me, now get in and make our dinner. I have had that a few times.
First of all, she's a really slow driver. We can't make it up to Devon in 9 hours, half the day, which really annoys me. I mean, my dad kind of zooms through and he gets there in 2 hours. For instance, today actually, she said she'd give me some money, and then when we got to school, she'd completely forgotten her purse. She doesn't really think it. She's really intelligent and clever, but she kind of failed her GCSEs.
Alex is a very, very loving boy, and very bright and very caring, really. However, he can have terrible fits of temper, and if he gets jealous or the fit of low self-esteem, it comes out in a violent way towards me, and abusive too.
I love my mother, but she can be annoying. She's a loving person. I think she cares a lot about us, and she rouses my dad in 2 ways. In a lot of ways, my dad's got better ways of doing things than her. But in a way, he's not very good at cooking, but she is. She's good at looking after us, but she's not good at handling arguments and stuff like that. She's just, a very, very dramatic woman. It's like a Laurence Olivier play. I can't go on and things like that. I was threatened to ring the police. I think she blackmails us a lot.
Lawrence is absolutely adorable, and I just love every inch of him. I think he's gorgeous. I think he's good looking. I think he's beautiful looking. Gorgeous face. Very clever, very bright, and funny. I think very alive. I think he's brilliant. But he's got a terrible temper, and he can be a real bugger at times. Oh, he said my teeth are yellow, I'm old and ugly, and I never finish anything. I say I'm going to do it, and I don't. He has a way of putting his finger on the truth. Oh yes, he says I'm a failure. He said I'm a failure, which has hurt because I think of myself as a failure.
I don't like the way she dresses to my school. She doesn't try very hard, she doesn't look very good. She goes to stupid clubs that aren't kind of really necessary. She doesn't dress too young. Sometimes she just looks at things in the shop and she's really too young. She thinks a bit too much of herself. I think she's afraid of getting old in a way.
I think having children brings out two very, very extreme emotions in us, which is that one's constantly faced with the border of love and hate. Love is the usual, the major emotion, but at times you do really, really, feel hate towards them.
I'm not horrible. I'm a bit more, I stand up for my rights a bit more than my mum. She's a bit kind to people.
Okay, I think you've got the point. Wearing both makes visible and puts into question the gendered and age expectations we typically bring to what we see and hear by disrupting these expectations. The sighs and repetitions, the tone of a voice, its hesitations are transfigured because of the dislocation of the sentiments and thoughts these voices express from the cultural systems of reference that might normally render them legible and intelligible in relation to particular faces, genders, or ages. Thus, when 2 young boys are seen to speak in the voice of their mother, the mixture of sentiments she feels for her sons, the cruelty of some of their remarks is thrown into relief, but so too are the cultural gendered systems out of which they arise. The material tics and affects of the voices we hear, their despair, resignation, hopelessness, hate, love, admiration, self-doubt, humiliation, recrimination, impatience, derision, are embodied in ways that are unexpected, such that the expectations we bring to what we hear are both made visible and put into question. In this way, Waring's work can be understood, in Rancière's words, to, quote, undo the sensible fabric, the given order of relations between meanings and the visible. And by the way, this is not a work of art that Rancière himself speaks about, but it's one I think his ideas are applicable to. The photographs and video installations of Gillian Waring throw into relief the normative expectations we bring to our perceptions in terms of race, gender, and age, for example. Waring plays with the dominance of visual understanding, displacing and dislocating the smooth operation of visual cues and auditory cues. Daniel Barnes describes the effect of Waring's iconic series, signs that say what you want them to say and not signs that say what other people want you to say, which is a 1992-93 piece, in terms that also offer insight into her work 2 into 1. As Barnes says, Waring stopped people in the midst of doing something else and demanded that they have a thought to share, asking them to write down their immediate thoughts, allowing their consciousness to spill over. Barnes describes the effect of the placards, like this one, held by members of the public, which Waring photographs in terms of the disparity between the look on their faces and the thoughts written on their cards. A policeman who is supposed to help people simply writes "help." An urbane-looking businessman in a suit writes on his placard, "I'm desperate." In 2 into 1, the effect of disparity is starker still when Waring undercuts the gendered, affective, and age-specific expectations produced by the visual cues. Sorry, I went one ahead there. Produced by the visual cues of the 2 white middle-class twin brothers and in school uniforms sitting on chairs next to one another as they lip-sync the words of their mother, who is reflecting on her relationship with the 2 boys. They appear to voice the conflicting, fraught, and poignant sentiments their mother harbours for them, a mixture, as she says at one point, of love and hate. This technique calls up, among other things, the waywardness of generational transmission of effects and parenting techniques and the gendering thereof. At the same time, it persistently refuses to give way to one gender or the other, one age or another. Using the same technique, Waring has the boy's mother appear to voice the words of her sons, including the view that she has a flair for the dramatic, sometimes saying, "I can't go on," as if she were in a Laurence Olivier play. We hear these words in the voice of her son, but we see her face with her lips moving. One can all too easily imagine this characterization intoned by one of the boys to have been adopted from their father, who is unknown as far as the video installation is concerned. This simile is too mature to have come from one of the twins, no matter how sophisticated they think they are. The boys concede that their mother is good at looking after them, but think that she is not very good at arguments. As for their mother, she thinks that Lawrence is adorable, very bright, beautiful looking, but that he can also be very cruel and has a habit of putting his finger on the truth, as when he calls her a failure, something which she herself feels she is, and when he diagnoses her inability to follow through on things. The way in which Waring plays with our expectations in works such as Fear and Loathing and 2 into 1 highlights and problematizes the routine assumptions and expectations around gender, race, and age that structure everyday life. There is a fabric, a warp, and a weft of the world that passes for acceptability. It happens every day, every second, every millisecond. It happens all over the world, in corridors, conferences, workplaces, streets, on the train, in universities, in the desert. Little instances of aggression, microaggressions, little gestures, not so little gestures, a series of words, a string of unchallenged assumptions feeding seamlessly into the fabric of things. You've seen it all a million times before. The racial context of Serena Williams' reception on court and off by tennis aficionados is brought to the surface by a series of observations by the poet Claudia Rankine, who in her book Citizen, an American Lyric, refers to all the manifestly incorrect line calls made by white umpires in crucial tennis games that Serena would have won without these blatantly incorrect line calls. Neither her father nor her mother, says Rankine, nor her sister, nor Jehovah, her God, nor Nike camp could shield her ultimately from the people who felt her black body didn't belong on their court, in their world. That was a quote from Rankine. Rankine says the way in which Serena's body can appear in the historically white space of the world of tennis reminds her of Zora Neale Hurston's, quote, "I feel most coloured when I am thrown against a sharp white background." If politics is, as Rancière suggests, a matter of aesthetics, and aesthetics is white, do black bodies fluctuate? Are there moments, places, occurrences only achieved when thrown against a sharp white background, or can they transform the colour of that background? How can those fragile, this is a quote from Rancière, fragile and fleeting inscriptions of equality that managed to establish themselves be extended and maximised so that the power of these inscriptions is materialised? Thinking together Rankine's reflections on what it takes to become a citizen and Rancière's reflections on the distribution of space and time and how it suggests new ways of framing and counting subjects, let's say that if perception is structured by what Rancière calls the partition of the perceptible that defines the lot of individuals and parties. Such divisions inform what subjects see and hear, what we allow ourselves to feel, how we judge the world, engage ourselves in relation to its reality, its sanity or insanity, our sanity or insanity, how our perceptions and judgments are structured by doubts and disbelief, by blindness and failures. So at this point, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I've kind of outlined very roughly and readily some of Rancière's views on politics and art. And at this point, I want to kind of mount a qualified challenge to his work. So I'm going to show a series of images and just see what you think of these, really. If our cultural imaginary is structured by unconscious assumptions about the appropriate ways to depict objects, matter, or content, it is also structured by who is allowed to count as an artist. What is at stake is precisely what constitutes the givenness of community, who is allowed to belong and who is not, who is recognized as belonging or granted the legitimacy to belong, and therefore what constitutes the community is in question. For Rancière, it is a question of seeing what happens when we move away from a model of politics as consensual, which claims to speak for all, but in fact speaks only for those who govern the terms on which claims are deemed to have or lack legitimacy or intelligibility. It is a question of seeing what happens when we move away from a model of art that takes itself to be representative, but in fact consists of a highly specific and set of exclusive norms that dictate what can and cannot be represented, how it should be represented, and who is entitled to judge it. Expressed positively, it is a question of seeing what happens when politics is reconceived, not as consensus, but as dissensus, when representation is no longer restricted by rules of appropriateness, where the operative model of art is porous, rather than a model that secures the boundaries of art by preserving its purity from contamination, by everything it stipulates as something other than art. I turn to a work by the Guerrilla Girls, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, in order to both think through Rancière's appeal to dissensus more thoroughly and introduce a qualified challenge to it. We might approach this work in two different ways. At first glance, we could regard it as simply occupying the role of a political slogan or a manifesto which didactically attempts to tell a public what to think. Understood thus, the work would purport to reveal a truth for an audience that stands in need of revelation. This work of art would thus fit seamlessly into what Rancière calls the pedagogical model, whereby a previously ignorant public is ostensibly enlightened through exposure to a meaningful spectacle which elicits awareness of the state of the world. In serving a political purpose, the work would mobilize the public, galvanizing its viewers into action, and in the process, it would evacuate its status as art by resolving itself into a political agenda. The work of art would position itself so as to provide, quote, forms of awareness or rebellious impulses for politics, end quote. Art would thus, quote, take leave of itself in order to become a form of collective political action. Just as Rossler's work denounces the capitalist war machine as hypocritical, so the Guerrilla Girls would decry the art establishment as a sexist institution. Inasmuch as we take the point of the work to be self-evident, such that its political formulae is readily identifiable, its political commentary can be dismissed as largely redundant. If the message of the work of art is so readable as to be completely obvious, not only is the artistic status of the work of art in question, so too is its political merit. In fact, since the Guerrilla Girls first produced this work, the number of female artists whose work the art establishment deems worthy of one-person shows, as documented by a further series of works by the Guerrilla Girls, remains consistently low, which suggests that, however obvious the message might be, there is still a need to reiterate it. And this actually refers to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, but there's another work that some of you might be familiar with, which just simply says it's worse in Europe. In question for Rancière is not only whether in making a political point, a work of art becomes too didactic to retain its status as a work of art in any meaningful sense, whether it crosses a definitive line and becomes a political statement. The question is also whether a work of art advocates a form of politics that adheres to a model of consensus, which posits a community to come that would be unified according to a shared ideal in a manner consistent with Romanticism, or whether in view of what he calls the aesthetic cut, the work of art, quote, questions its own limits and powers, accepts its insufficiency, refuses to anticipate its own effects in framing a new landscape of the sensible. Rather than assimilating this work by the Guerrilla Girls to the pedagogical logic from which Rancière seeks to distance art as dissensus, or critiquing it for its aspiration to leave its status as art in order to become political, or become a political slogan that inspires collective action, according to the logic of consensus, let's consider the work from an alternative point of view, which I will refer to for the sake of argument as a work of art. Some might see it as a political poster. It was, after all, commissioned as a billboard. In fact, part of both the complexity and the appeal of Rancière is his insistence on maintaining the ambiguity of borders between works of art and other objects, political or otherwise. It is of some interest that this particular work concerns itself not only with the art of politics, but also with the politics of art. That is, it offers a commentary on the relationship between the artist and the subject of the work of art. It does so not by asserting a political position, but by posing a question. It asks a rhetorical question and juxtaposes the question with two empirical claims. The question, do women have to be naked in order to get into the Met Museum, is juxtaposed with a claim about the gender of artists whose work is on display in the museum, and a claim about the gendering of the subjects represented in the works displayed. If the number of female artists represented in the modern art section of New York's Metropolitan Museum is less than 5%, and 85% of the nudes represented are female, the implicit conclusion is that the vast majority of works representing naked women are by male artists. If we read the question that is being posed not only in the context of the observations specifying the gender of the majority of artists on display and the subjects they represent, but also against the background of the image of a female body that is foregrounded, we understand that what is being asked is not merely whether there is a relation between the gender of the artists represented in art museums and the subject matter they represent. In question, rather, is how women's bodies are being represented and what purposes their representation serves. In question is whether the only way that women can be granted access to museums is in the form of representations that present women as passive objects of a male gaze. Women then would only enter into museums in the guise of material content for male artists who impose artistic form on the passive matter to which women's bodies have been reduced in representations by men and for a heteronormative masculine symbolic. The active imposition of form on passive matter is a hallmark of the representative regime, for Rancière is here explicitly aligned with male subject artists representing female object bodies. By asking about the gendering of subjects typically displayed in museums and how they are typically represented, we can understand this work as commenting on some of the defining features of what Rancière calls the representative order, the norms that dictate, in Rancière's words, quote, which subjects and forms of expression were deemed worthy of inclusion, or what artistic conventions are appropriate for which subjects. We can see this work as commenting on the fact that the representative order, quote, set those concerned by art apart from those it did not concern, end quote, and as challenging typical assumptions about whose concern art is. Here, the subject is represented as a supine figure reposing in a fashion that specifically cites a painterly image, and in doing so also evokes a litany of paintings spawned in the same tradition. Yet the work does not merely cite this painting or mimic this tradition, though it does this, thereby reminding us that at issue here is not whether female nudes should be on display in museums, but how they are displayed and by whom, for what purposes, with what effects. The question posed is whether one of the effects is to preclude women from being taken seriously as artists or from having art as a serious concern. At the same time, this work by the Guerrilla Girls subverts the tradition it playfully cites, replacing a woman's head with a gorilla's head, fusing a female figure with the head of an animal, repeating with a critical edge a trope that has been affected so often before. One thinks of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Gorillas are often caged in zoos for a public to view, a reference perhaps to the passivity of the women on display by male artists in museums, curated for the pleasure of spectators. The gorilla head points to the habitual association of women with animals, to the reduction of women's speech to noise, at the same time as it refigures women's alleged wildness as a refusal to be contained within the frame of animality. To recycle a point made by Catherine McKinnon in a slightly different manner, we might ask, tongue-in-cheek, what chance does a woman have of having her art or words taken seriously, of being construed as an artist or heard as an art critic, when she is reclining naked in a museum within a frame. On this occasion, the ripos must be every chance, far from quelling the speech of the unidentified collective group that goes by the name of Guerrilla Girls. This particular framing of a supine female body graphically represents their speech within the same frame. Their speech spills out beyond the frame, putting into question a history of well-rehearsed tropes and conventions that define the appropriate depiction of women's bodies. Yet, if there is an insistence upon being heard, there's also a playful citation to and incorporation of a history of art that reiterates old themes in a new way, transgressing and revising the norms that infuse them in a humorous manner. The work performs a citation to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' La Grande Odalisque, which dates to 1814. The pose of the female body that appears in Ingres, recumbent on a chaise longue, is readily recognizable in the version presented by the Guerrilla Girls, but a gorilla head replaces the female head, and a question is posed by the script written above the figure. The question this work by the Guerrilla Girls is asking us then is, how much has really changed in the years separating us from Ingres? How long will it take for 50% of the artists represented in the Metropolitan Museum in New York or any other major art institution to be female? And how would this transform not so much which subjects are depicted, but how they are depicted, for what ends and with what effects? The Guerrilla Girls have updated their figures originally provided for 1989 and updated in 2005 and 2012, when the percentage of female artists to female nudes on display were 3% to 83% or 4% to 76% respectively. Similarly, in another work, they provide figures for how many women had one-person shows in New York galleries. In 1985, only one woman had such a show at the Modern. In 2015, one woman had a show at the Guggenheim, Metropolitan, and Whitney, and there were 2 one-person women shows at the Modern. There is a robust line of male artists following in the steps of Ingres, whose inspiration is not hard to map, whose work we are well accustomed to viewing in art museums. For example, Pablo Picasso's Le Grand Odalisque d'après Ingres, 1907. We might begin to construct an alternative history by referring to Baby Back, 2001, by Jamaican-born American artist Renee Cox, a work included in American Family. Like the Guerrilla Girls, Cox also cites Ingres' Odalisque, imitating the pose of the female nude depicted there, but changing the colour of the skin and thereby challenging white European ideals of beauty. The work is a self-portrait in which the artist wears red high spiky heels, dangles a phallic whip from her hand, and reclines on a chaise longue, her back to the viewer, her buttocks prominent, calling up other works by Cox in which she implicitly imitates the cartoon caricature images to which Saartjie Baartman was subjected when she was paraded in Europe as a freak, her remains having been returned by the Musée de l'Homme to their rightful country of origin only in 2002, although her death was in 1815. If Cox plays with the question of race, other works refigure gender and class. A long series of works have responded to Ingres' La Grande Odalisque. In The Great Maiden, by a Moroccan artist, Tufik, a bearded figure reposes in a fashion that again echoes Ingres' Odalisque, in which the female nude turns her head coyly over her shoulder, acknowledging the gaze of the viewer, and dangles a feather fan from her right hand. The fan, which is also suggestive of autoeroticism, a phallic appendage, becomes a whip in Cox's rendering, a reference to slavery perhaps, but one that reverses the power relationship of white domination, since here it is a black woman who wields authority over the whip. In Tufik's rendering, the fan becomes a feather duster held by a hand clad in a bright pink rubber glove, accompanied by a plastic spray bottle of cleaning fluid in the left foreground of the picture and a vacuum cleaner in the right background. In this context, the headscarf worn by the figure, citing Ingres' turban, is reminiscent of a bandana that might be worn by a cleaning woman, worn here, however, by a trans figure. Tufik's reclining body is on display, while the paraphernalia of housework codes her in a way that both indicates and departs from the subservient feminized service roles to which cleaners and housewives, usually employed for poor wages or unpaid, are typically consigned. Often consigned to invisibility, the task of cleaning takes on a highly visible role here in the shape of a trans figure, challenging conventional gender configurations and mimicking, even while departing from, the class privilege of the reclining females depicted by Ingres in works such as Odalisque and Le Bain Turc, women attended by, in Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's words, they're generally pretty slaves, braiding their hair in several pretty manners. If the Guerrilla Girls focus attention upon the relative scarcity of female artists represented in public art museums in relation to the relative plethora of female nudes depicted, Cox brings into focus the invisible standard of whiteness informing both the museum culture and the feminist challenge the Guerrilla Girls pose to it, while Tewfik draws attention to the heteronormativity and gender stereotypes of museum culture, I should say standard museum culture, which are reflective of culture in general. In doing so, Cox and Tewfik interrogate assumptions that pervade communities that constitute themselves as feminist, which are capable of constituting their own versions of the police order. This is just an updated version of the image we saw before. So in conclusion, the works of art by the Guerrilla Girls, Cox and Tewfik, draw attention to how museums, the exhibits they display and the audiences they target are themselves implicated in nationalist, colonialist, racist and cisgender agendas, which the works by the Guerrilla Girls, Cox and Tewfik render visible and put into question. Whether the political messages of these works of art will be obvious to a particular viewer will depend, to some extent, upon the communities within which they live and what assumptions they take for granted. Thanks.
Please.